I'll start by thanking, of course, first and first to our guest speaker, Gavin Greenwood, for joining us. Thank you to all the attendees that subscribed to our NSSG Talks, and also, of course, thank you to those that are watching us live right now. We thank you for joining us, and most importantly, we will share a bit of thoughts about NSSG and what we stand for, not only in the risk management industry, but extensively in the business industry. So basically, the NSSG talks that we are welcoming you all to attend today has started from our team's wish to share knowledge, to share information, and to actually bring an objective and an expert-backed opinion about the relevant global events that are happening and that are imposing some implications, some risks on our businesses. Whether you're, of course, a business entrepreneur, or you're just a simple employee within a business organization, these events are impacting you in one way or another. Of course, to this mission of knowledge sharing, we also try to corrupt as many as possible. And for this, I have a real strong appreciation to Gavin Greenwood, director at A2 Global Risk. I'll share a brief presentation about Gavin, because it's very hard to capture it in a few words, and I don't want to lose too much time of our meeting today, because I want to pass the microphone to him. So why is Gavin's presence so important for us? Gavin has more than 40 years of experience in providing meaningful intelligence analysis for business and media organizations with respect to the events happening in what we call a PAC region. So if we talk about Asia, and if we talk about, of course, our topic of today, China, this is the person that you need to question about, and this is the person that you should listen to. So thank you so much, Gavin, for joining us. Of course, I will not have this conversation with such an important figure of the intelligence business industry without the support of my colleague Joe Frederick, senior consultant at NSSG, and the person that I like to say that is making an art of analyzing geopolitical events and drawing the line towards the business impact that could pose on your organizations. So thank you both for joining us today. Of course, as I said, I will not spend too much time in the introduction and marketing part. You can have a lot of information about NSSG at nssg.global, and of course, a lot of information about A2 Global Risk, our partner of today's talks. So yeah, feel free to reach out to us. Feel free to engage with us. All the information is out there on the internet. So I will just pass the microphone right now to Joe. Please, Joe, make a smarter introduction to our topic of today than I did so far.
Nah, you did absolutely brilliantly, Lily. Thank you very much. So today's topic is decoupling from China, and I'm very delighted to have Gavin Greenwood with us. He, as Lily mentioned, he's got extensive experience in the region. With the, there's written work still can be seen in the media today. He's frequently called upon to interview on and provide his insights and analysis on just about everything Asia related. So we're extremely kind of honored, privileged, and happy to have Gavin Greenwood with us today. So again, we're talking about China, and it seems like China is getting a lot of media attention, and maybe for all the wrong reasons, sorry, maybe for all the wrong reasons, depending on your perspective. And it almost seems like, China's increasing assertiveness is being interpreted as kind of very hostile by the West, when probably, every state has its national interests that they need to kind of cater towards. And, every Western European country expands their influence in trade and diplomacy and security matters, but yet they don't get criticized, by the West, especially on being assertive, basically. And so the next slide I'd like to kind of pop up, Lily.
Sure, just a quick technical note that I skipped to mention. Our discussion right now is recorded, so please, those of you that will not like to pop up in our video, please keep your cameras shut down, and there will be a quick Q&A session at the end. Sorry for this interruption.
Right. Okay. Right. So for this particular kind of NSSG Talks, we decided not to overkill the PowerPoint presentation. So it really kind of revolves on this particular slide that you're seeing in front of you. And what we've presented here are, two different perspectives on China's activities and how they're being interpreted. So if you look on the left side of the slide, there are a lot of headlines recently about China's activities and kind of comments from diplomats and how they're being kind of portrayed in the media, basically. And on the right side of the slide, you'll see the media from China, interpreting its activities and the activities of the West and their allies as well. And it's quite important to take note that, this is how, a lot of businesses are kind of framing this discussion on what their activities are going to be with respect to China, and at this stage, it looks like there's an inevitability. The way the media is portraying it is that there's going to be some kind of conflict in the future, whether that be a kind of trade conflict or an actual conflict, particularly over Taiwan at this moment. So, Gavin, what do you think about these kind of media portrayals? I mean, this is what we're inundated with every day, basically. And granted, there are slight nuances to each of these kind of reports that are coming out, basically, but what do you think about all the kind of media portrayal of what's happening at this today?
Well, thank you both. And first of all, I'd just like to apologize for my voice. I've got a bit of a cough, and so I sound a bit croaky. So I do apologize for that in advance. I think one of the great the problems and indeed advantages of certainly the Western media is that it is often quite anarchic in the sense of it tends to follow stories which are often dramatic, often obviously follow agendas. I think we can safely say across all of everybody listening in here in their respective countries, there are papers which adhere to the right or the left or attempt to be centrist or whatever. All of these factors pin into one another. Meanwhile, back in China or over in China, there is not such a diversity in the media. So whatever we see from China, essentially now what we're seeing, particularly over the last, shall we say, 4 or 5 years, but even going back really to the beginning of President Xi's leadership, which goes back to I think 2012, a somewhat more monolithic view. So while we can look at the Western media's take on China and often discard it for the grounds I've just said, it can be partial, it can be political, it can have something to do with domestic issues. What we see from China tends to be, if you like, adhering to the state line. So China's view should be taken seriously, regardless as to how one might find that hard, again, particularly from sort of a Western liberal view, put it that way. It is nevertheless, it is worth the effort of actually unpicking and unpacking what is being said in the papers that, generally speaking, we can all access as non-Chinese speakers, the People's Daily, Global Times, and so on. So I just make that broad point, is that there are, as I say, just in this conversation, two medias, the Western media and the Chinese media, of which, in many ways, the most significant is the Chinese media, because they're telling us something which otherwise we really would find very hard to get through to.
Yeah.
I'll just move on if I may. Oh, go on, Joe. Sorry.
Oh no, please continue with that thought.
Well, what I was now going to say was that the title of this talk is decoupling, the key word, which I gave to Joe when Joe asked me what I thought was the key issue. I've now had a slight sort of change, not on decoupling, but events in the very recently, in the last few days, have made me amend that to a certain extent. And I will cite two people who have talked specifically about this. One is the President of the European Union, Ursula von der Leyen, and the other is US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen. Both in the certainly last week, have both addressed this concept of decoupling and how their respective countries, regimes, if you like, or blocs, in the case of the EU and the United States, view this. And both have produced very interesting takes on this, to use a journalistic expression. They both raise the issue that decoupling is a very bad idea, at the same time suggesting that the West generally, collectively, has its own interests, its own security interests, which it must prioritize. Now, for those who are familiar with British political jargon, this is what we call cakeism. That is to say, having your cake and eating it. You're having contradictory views, both of which really don't quite function together. But nevertheless, this is where we are. This is where the United States position is and the EU position, and I'm sure that of other countries.
Yeah, Gavin.
What I would go on.
Sorry, Gavin. Yeah. So,
Say again.
I think those are kind of very valid points there, and I think decoupling seems to be a kind of a strong term to use, and it doesn't serve anyone's interest, basically. Two questions about decoupling. One is the kind of contextual aspect. There's a decoupling means something different to the West, and decoupling also means something different to China as well. And also, it seems as if it's nearly impossible to completely divorce yourself from a kind of trade basis from China these days because of globalization and the fact that China is the kind of global manufacturer, basically. So the term that I've come across is de-risking, right? So kind of spreading your risk around by, on your supply chain in particular.
Yes, I fully agree with that. And again, de-risking is the term that Ursula von der Leyen had used. I would add two other variants of that. I would say detoxification or decontamination, very increasingly toxic relationship. And the other one is a bit more dramatic, is defusing, which has obviously military or kinetic implications if one takes that as an extreme. That is to say, we're clearly heading for, we're already in a period of much heightened tension, which shows absolutely no sign whatsoever of despite the two interventions by the EU and the United States, of changing. Nothing has come back from China really in relation to these, other than a somewhat divisive sort of, well, yes, and maybe and best stuff, and literally that sort of vague, nothing coherent and nothing solid, and certainly no sense from China that they are that they see this in any other way other than perhaps even the West doing two things at once. One is being conciliatory, which for what the Chinese call wolf warrior sort of diplomacy would see as a sign of weakness, and the technocrats, the far more trade orientated and far more sort of open people would see as a threat, because they see that if China does not in some way compromise or offer some sort of way around or agreement to the Western concerns, is that obviously the West will crank up and increase its already existing pressure on trade and business with China. and China will, in the nature of things, respond accordingly, and it already is. There are reports in the last 24 hours of the Chinese tightening up on information, which they term as espionage in relation to Western companies operating in China. That people really don't know. Companies don't know where lines are increasingly. They don't know in China, to a broader extent, they don't know in Hong Kong, let alone China, as to quite where lines are being drawn as to what is acceptable, permissible, and will not get you, or more to the point, almost your staff, your executives, both local and expatriate, into trouble. So we're in a sort of murky, I think what the Germans would call Nacht und Nebel, a sort of night and fog sort of position where you really are stumbling along, trying to use touch rather than reason to get a grip on what is happening now and what is likely to happen in whichever outlook you want to see, 3 months, 6 months, and then medium term, 5 years.
Yeah, I think
so. That would be my response to you.
Yeah, I think we've already seen kind of like one repercussion of this tightening of this counter-espionage law was the fact that there was a detention of a Japanese national who worked for a pharmaceutical company. And the Japanese response has been quite typical, claiming that he didn't do anything wrong, but then the Chinese government claiming that he was a spy for the Japanese government, basically. And so we're clearly heading towards more risks for businesses operating in China. Sorry, Lily, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, dear Gavin, because you just touched a very interesting point right here. So basically, this is a very strong proof that the geopolitical events are impacting on business, whether you like it or not, whether you're politically affiliated, you're following the events or not. So please, if you can elaborate more about this new trend of espionage towards the business organizations operating in the area, that will be very interesting for us and, of course, for our followers.
Well, it's some of the work that I've been involved in, and indeed so has Joe, is in the nature of work where foreign companies, for many reasons, technical and legal reasons, have to have a knowledge and a sense of what their partners in China, or indeed anywhere else, are doing, what their background is. It's due diligence. I'm sure all of our people listening now know perfectly well what that means, and indeed duty of care. So that is all part of, in the West, under normal things, is just part of a normal business process. You want to know what your whoever you're going to do business with, who they are, what they're if there's anything there that is going to cause you legal, technical, possibly reputational problems. Again, perfectly standard. The problem is, or the problem has already been revealed in China and has been revealed for some time, is that these questions and this type of questioning can be viewed very, very quickly, and increasingly so now, as being intrusive and, shall we say, a form of spying. And for a foreign company who have obviously their regulatory responsibility goes back to their home country, they are now in an awkward position, to say the least, where they have to carry out their due diligence, they have to carry out their checks, their business and background checks and so forth, and now are put in a position and we're not sure how they can do this, and without necessarily crossing China's red lines. And there have been cases of people, again, in the type of work that I've been engaged in, and indeed Joe, who have been detained. British national, famously so some years ago, was detained for 18 months for involvement in a case with a Western company and a Chinese partner. So these things are real. I mean, these things have happened. The case that Joe mentions about the Japanese company and its executive. The Japanese are particularly vulnerable to this for historical reasons, shall we say. And so China, Japan ties, they can be tied. These events can be also related to geopolitical issues relating to offshore islands and maritime disputes, as well as the actual modalities of a particular business issue. So it's it's the new reality for companies. They have to think about this, and they have to think how do they balance between their own regulatory, internal and national legal requirements and those of China.
Do you think the tightening of this counter-espionage law will kind of force companies to, I guess, de-risk? Going back to the term de-risk again, kind of, not completely decouple from China, but also kind of send some investors saying, hey, maybe we should kind of take our investment elsewhere. And doesn't that kind of, I don't know, work against China?
I'm sure I'm sure they would, again, to the as I mentioned, if you like, in my introduction, the technocrats, often the private companies, although there's really very hard to say what a private company in China is actually without they're all tied one way or the other to the state and therefore the Communist Party. But nevertheless, those who aren't actually, government companies, state companies themselves, they're aware of this. They've been and again, a lot of them have been targeted themselves. We know about Ant, and we know about people like Jack Ma, whose company has been people have seen it. People, major political, economic, business figures have from time to time simply disappeared. They've gone. They've gone off the radar. They disappear, and then they may re-emerge some months later and find a lot of their company. These are big Chinese companies, usually in high tech, but not exclusively, has been chopped up into bits, into component parts, and sent off all over parts of the Chinese, often state apparatus, to be dealt with. So nobody, while Western companies think they've got problems in China, they're nothing close to what the problems with a great many of the Chinese, particularly the entrepreneurial ones, who one could argue those are the ones who are usually the companies which the Western companies choose to do business with, rather than, say, working for Chinese state companies, major ones like steel, cement, and the obvious big construction companies and banks, all of which are the term compromise would be the wrong term perhaps, but it would be awkward for them to deal with something which is actually basically part of the Communist Party of China, and then still be able to report back to their shareholders in New York or Frankfurt or London.
Yeah, I mean, let's kind of stay within China, and kind of looking at the kind of internal power dynamics, right? So you mentioned that these state companies are being, or these kind of private companies that have become too big, it seems like, and they're being broken up on purpose, possibly. And that plays into the kind of power struggles and internal power dynamics within China. I know we talked earlier about kind of President Xi himself, like kind of he won his kind of third term in office, so he'll be there for the next 5 years or so. But he is also facing these kind of internal battles as well, and a lot of what's happening within China and possibly outside of China is being driven by his need to kind of stay in power. I wonder if you could give some insight on that.
Well, again, Chinese politics, as viewed from outside, always again tends to be monolithic. We see the great imageries of the Great Hall of the People and the 20th People Congress, which was to the end of last year, where President Xi was coronated, and is basically for life. Behind all that is a complete sort of whole mass and maze of conflicting issues of often regionally based, invariably regionally based loyalties. Practically every Chinese leader, I would say, since 1949, since the creation of the People's Republic of China, has come from a regionally based faction, which is, given China's emphasis on a unified nation, is quite extraordinary, really. So regional power is a reality. It is often supersedes that of centralized power in Beijing. So what goes on in the provinces can often be completely sort of antithetical to what goes on in Beijing. And on top of that is the sense of what Xi has achieved in gaining power and now keeping it, is to alienate and frankly terrify a great many members of the Chinese elite. Now the Chinese elite is basically the only threat, the only major disruptive threat to China's leadership. It isn't the masses. The masses are no threat at all. They're just no way that a combination of everything, surveillance and indeed desire, it would seem, as long as they have work and incomes and things are going well for them, which is relatively easy to produce. But it's the elite who pose, as always, the greatest threat to any autocracy in the world. It's the same would obviously apply in Russia under present conditions there. President Putin is not threatened by the masses, but he certainly is must be a bit uneasy amongst some members of the elite whose lives and lifestyles he has compromised and who he threatens. And China is exactly the same.
Yeah, and so do you think a lot of these these kind of foreign policy activities or foreign policy statements are meant to kind of distract from what's happening within China, or to kind of I don't know, yeah, meant to kind of distract with what's happening within China?
Up to a point. I mean, the Chinese China's history has never really, as a state, chosen to go much beyond its own boundaries. In fact, which it has often defined literally physically. I mean, the Great Wall of China is a massive and obviously obvious example, literally a concrete example of China's desire to keep everybody out and often to keep everybody in. So the Chinese diaspora who have left China often, and they haven't left it, generally speaking, to spread the word. They've left it because they've had to leave it for economic reasons, for reasons of ambition, for reasons to better themselves and that of their families and so forth. So China's does not have a colonial or an outward going history other than beyond what people might argue, shall we say, with Tibet and so forth. But leaving that aside, they have not chosen to expand until quite recently as a state beyond their own natural borders as they see them. So, for example, what's happening in the South China Sea, where China declared its famous 9-dash line, which basically privatized most of the South China Sea, regardless of what the other littoral countries thought about it, and indeed the United States, and indeed the United Nations Law of the Sea. They still persist in this, and they build islands out of tiny atolls and all the rest of it, and put on airstrips and put missiles on there and so forth. I mean, that is unusual and new for China. Yeah. And frankly, they're not very good at it. Belt and Road, which is their sort of signature program, is massively in debt. There are some who are saying this is a deliberate policy, that if they can get countries into a debt trap, then they can sort of own them, like Sri Lanka and parts of Pakistan and so forth. Well, up to a point, but that is assuming that China accepts the sort of legal, or indeed the countries themselves accept the legal consequences of a contract.
Yeah.
And China is actually notoriously bad at doing contracts.
Hey, Gavin,
and following them through, as we've seen in Hong Kong.
Hey, Gavin, we got a question from one of our audience here, and while we're still kind of looking at the domestic, the question is, so he would like to hear your thoughts on the lack of youth league members in the standing committee, stroke Politburo, as question, one, and then question two is how seasoned diplomats like Wang Yi and Qin Gang might help to moderate China's foreign policy.
Can you repeat the first question, please? I missed the first bit.
The first question is
about
the first question is what is he wants you to know, he wants you to give your thoughts on the lack of youth league members in the standing committee of the Politburo for the CPP.
Well, the Youth League has, for internal purposes, they're previously very powerful. I mean, they've produced leaders in the past, and they, for all sorts of internal reasons, some of which literally we don't know. I mean, these are either personality or regional driven. And they have been, over the past, well, certainly since President Xi came to power, they've been marginalized. And this is, I think, generally speaking, part of his whole centralization, excuse me, centralization process and policy of really surrounding himself as far as he possibly can with loyalists, and one might argue compromising, having shall we say, the sort of layers of the onion, people around him, layer upon layer of people who have been have gained their positions, their authority through loyalty, demonstrations of loyalty, or even having, shall we say, loyalty imposed upon them. To which point that she remains the only patron they have. Mm-hmm. That is to say, whatever they had before in terms of a political base, which includes the youth, the youth part of the party, and indeed regional parties, provincial ones, are eroded and replaced by loyalty and patronage simply to Xi Jinping.
Yeah.
So that's the first one. Excuse my cough. And the second one was Chinese diplomats.
Yeah, seasoned diplomats.
We had a marvelous example of So go on.
So there were seasoned diplomats Chinese mentioned specifically. One is named Wang Yi and Qin Gang.
Yeah, I mean, I would take it more broadly than that. I think individuals, in a sense, diplomats, one would, they're all, as they are everywhere else, are beholden to their governments. That is their job. Their job is to represent the views of their government. Now, some do it better than others, obviously. Some are more emollient, some have better language skills, simple as that. Some are more sophisticated and subtle as to how they can engage with the host country that they're in, or organization that they go to, like the UN or whatever. Others less so. Ambassador Liu in Paris is an excellent example of what happens when that doesn't quite work. As I'm sure most people now listening in onto this or later will be aware of what he said about post-Soviet countries in Europe and their legitimacy, notably the Baltic countries. This, of course, has created a level of outrage in the EU and the individual countries involved. Whether this represents policy or whether Liu, who is a powerful figure in his own right, he was a former mayor of Wuhan, which a major city, and if you've been the mayor of that, that's a very powerful position. This is where Chinese leaders come from, is from being mayors of huge cities like Shanghai and Beijing, and indeed second tiers like Wuhan and so forth. So he's not a lightweight. He's not a diplomat in the sense that perhaps we have career people coming out through our foreign services and so forth. He's a political figure, and yet he said this. Now, whether he misspoke or whether this is something which the Communist Party wanted to get out for whatever reason, to perhaps support Russia, or perhaps sort of do a wolf warrior bit of assertive stuff. But the timing of it was absolutely extraordinary, because it occurred just within a week of President Macron of France seemingly attempting to divide the EU, and specifically France, but by extension the EU, from the United States policy on China. So again, I think most people engaged in foreign policy analysis and China watchers and all this are still digesting this, and trying to work out what on earth is going on here, whether this is simply an individual not talking on his own behalf, or whether this represents some sort of cunning plan and policy swerve or something. I mean, we don't know. Yeah. So my overall answer, excuse me, to the question is individual diplomats generally aren't that significant until they do something like Ambassador Liu, and
maybe you need some water there.
It's like risk and security budgets. Yeah, they're insufficient until the crisis hits. Thank you so much, Gavin, for giving this very interesting insight into China politics. I would like to go a bit back on the geopolitical aspect, on the to zoom out a bit, because you had a very interesting point that you mentioned about China and historical behavior of China of imposing a sort of other type of globalization. So if the West is of course purely pushing towards a globalization, but with democracy on, China doesn't care. China will make business with everybody. China will make business across Africa. China will make business in Eastern Europe. China will not question your politics and your level of democracy before putting out massive projects like roads, railroads, dam construction, and so on. So please comment a bit more about this perspective of China at global level and how it's perceived in this sector.
Well, I think there are 2 points. One is just pragmatic from China's point of view, which is they've developed a most extraordinary and highly skilled construction force, labor force. They, if you travel in China on things like their railways and so forth, and just see how cities just seem to appear out of nowhere very, very fast. And so they've done this, and they are truly quite remarkable in terms of how they can build. I mean, they're remorseless. They've just put a railway through from China to Thailand through Laos. And anyone who's been to Laos knows it's basically half of Laos is mountains. It's all actually a huge amount of mountains. The railway, which is 300 or so kilometers long, almost half of it is tunnels and bridges. And they built this railway in 5 years. I mean, in Britain here, we're trying to build a high-speed railway up to Birmingham, which might be ready by 2045.
I don't want to talk about Romania's construction.
I say that just. Well, no, I would only mention my own country rather than have a go at anyone else's in this terms. But anyway, the point is that China and Chinese engineers and construction people are brilliant, and they are. But I wouldn't say they've finished. I wouldn't say China is now fixed. They're still building all sorts of, but they've substantially. They've created a huge, infrastructure, railway, road, etc. infrastructure, amazingly so, and very quickly. So they have this capacity, and there are countries who would welcome having this investment. They might find it complicated later when it comes to paying for it, but in the interim, they'll just sort of they'll take the cement now over the possible debts, and all, in fact, almost certain debts. In terms of whether this hard engineering equates into soft power is another matter. Almost everywhere where China goes and Chinese companies go, be it in Africa, be it in Central Asia, be it in Pakistan or Sri Lanka, they run into opposition, and they run into it becomes extremely complicated in some parts of the world. Pakistan is an excellent example where Chinese construction teams are routine targeted by separatist groups in Pakistan, for example. Those that neighboring countries like India are averse to see this have anything to do with it or not is something else altogether. But they're certainly they are layer upon layer of almost sort of great game type things going on, which where China has, if you like, exposed itself by going outside, often into unfamiliar territory, and it finds itself in Africa as well with all sorts of problems and issues there from a micro level. Literally, individuals. I think there's an estimate of 2 million Chinese nationals are now working in Africa in one capacity or another. Some for the state, some just for themselves, and they're often resented, not least because a lot of the projects do not use local labour, or they use it at a very low level. They've done this before. They built a railway, the famous Tazara railway, from the coast of Mozambique up to Zambia to bring out the copper under Mao Zedong. I've been there. I've seen the railway. It's covered in weeds. It's just not barely used at all, or it certainly wasn't when I was last there, and so forth. So they've had this. They've done it before. Where this will end up is a bunch of weeds growing up through railway tracks, as nobody can afford to run the trains, and the business model collapses, or there's coup, or they lose their power with the government. Remains to be seen. But I think history would say that at least some of these projects will go exactly that way. They will end up as white elephants. They will end up as massive investments with very little profitable outcome to China, if one uses conventional accounting methods, that is to say, profit and loss, just simply in terms of money.
Hey, Gavin.
I think it's something which may or may not generally appeal domestically. My personal experience of dealing with people years ago who were, I mentioned the Tazara.
Yeah. Can you hear me, Gavin? I think there's like some kind of delay. But I'll go ahead and ask the question because I think you can hear me. It's just delayed. So, I think we've got kind of two final questions for you.
I can now. Oh, yes.
Okay. So there are two final questions for you. So one related to international trade, while we're kind of still on that topic. But I'd also like to end with the question about Taiwan, basically. And so, or the question about trade comes from one of our analysts, and he asked about the prospects for the yuan replacing the dollar for international trade, basically. So what do you think about that?
Well, I can see what is happening in terms of trade with Russia and some other countries. But no, realistically, it's not possible. I mean, it's you would have to for that to happen. There would have to be such a radical readjustment in the entire sort of basis of how international financing and banking and everything works, and transparency as to on what basis is yuan renminbi valued, for example. I mean, what's behind it in an opaque political environment like China, the Communist Party, where, as we mentioned earlier, you start asking sort of pertinent questions about economic issues, sensitive economic issues, and suddenly you're into national security. Your crises of national security and so forth. So no, I mean it's fine if you're dealing with the Russians, who have very few other options and who are becoming, I would say, a minor partner of China. And frankly, if they've got any sense in Russia, they would be, instead of messing around with Ukraine and so forth, they would be reinforcing their borders up in eastern in the Russian Far East, because sooner or later, I suspect China might give that a good look and have a bit of that back, because that is just full of resources and all sorts of things China feels that they that they lost in the past. So anyway, that's a completely separate topic. But
Gavin,
but no, it's not. I mean, there's no way.
Gavin, okay. So one last question from me, and I think we'll open up to Q&A, and that is the perennial question about Taiwan, basically. And so, that's also gaining a lot of traction in kind of recent weeks. Is there going to be an invasion? If so, when, basically, and how the invasion is going to come, and what can businesses do about it? So, give us some insight on that. What do you think?
Well, I mean, people's concerns are obvious and understandable. Again, going back to right at the beginning of this conversation, where we looked at the media, and it's a great media story. I mean, the journalists love things like this, So there's lots of, either on TV or whatever, lots of ships and planes and people with guns and stuff like that. But and China, of course, has chosen to seek to intimidate Taiwan by demonstrating its own capacity to blockade Taiwan up to a point, while at the same time providing the West and Taiwan with a massive amount of useful operational intelligence as to their own capabilities. But again, that's kind of them. But the actual modalities of crossing the Taiwan Strait and landing an amphibious force in Taiwan and invading the country is simply technically beyond China's capabilities, and I'm sure desires to do. The coast of Taiwan facing China, there are 5 landing places. That's it. There are 5 beaches where you could actually land a force with armor and all the rest of it, which of course the Taiwanese are very, very much aware of where they are, and they're heavily defended and so forth. So it would be a very costly, very risky, for China's point of view, enterprise, and one which would be utterly transparent because of intelligence gathering, both state and private. I mean, every satellite in the world would be looking at this and would see a build-up of Chinese forces in ports up and down the coast of Fujian and so forth. And it would just be obvious that the Chinese were going to do something. But they can intimidate, and they've done that, and that can affect Taiwan's economic position. And it already has. I mean, people are now looking for alternates to Taiwan's massive role in as a huge fabrication, semiconductor fabrication center and so forth. So people are now saying, well, you know, well, if that's it, if we lose that, we need somewhere else. So that's a consequence. So that is a cost to Taiwan, of course. The other thing is obviously they could simply fire rockets at Taiwan, but that would just be annoying. It's certainly, unless they were nuclear, in which case it's the end of the story. So for everybody, so they could do what they did with Ukraine, with trying to knock out infrastructure and communications and stuff like that. But again, if they did that, almost every Western company would have to cease doing trade with business with China for that alone, as they have with Russia. There would be no, to my mind, there'd be no difference. They would just have Ford and all the big companies, Volkswagen, everybody who builds cars in China, everything would have to just, they'd have to just walk off the job, frankly, if China attacked Taiwan in that manner, in a like the Russian way in Ukraine, without landing one soldier on Taiwan. So that would be something for obviously companies to think about in China and indeed in Taiwan and elsewhere. It would be, as I think Foreign Minister Cleverly yesterday, or reported today rather, said that this would, you know, any attempt to attack or intervene in attack, you know, basically attack Taiwan, would completely almost wreck global trade. And I think he was right, or the people who wrote his speech were absolutely right.
I
So
read
I hope
that. He also warned of kind of miscalculation.
I could go on, but I don't. I'm not sure. Also, I would just add this: China's military has not fought a war since 1979, which they lost when they attacked Vietnam. I mentioned this yesterday when we were having a rehearsal. Romanian. Well, what I was just going to say is a Romanian corporal has more combat experience than a Chinese general, any Chinese general. 32,000 Romanians served in Afghanistan. 30 died, nearly 250 were wounded. China simply doesn't have that. You know, this is Romania. America, obviously, Britain and France, all the rest. But this, you know, that to contextualize their lack of combat experience, which is crucial. This is wars are fought when it comes down to it by people, you know, being very frightened on the ground, not by great displays in either Red Square or in Tiananmen Square. It is run. They're fought by men who've actually, and women who've had the experience of combat and have leaders who understand how this all works. So China looks, I mean, it looks their army, their navy, their air force, etc. all look splendid. You know, they're all brand new and they're all nicely packed. You know, they look fine. And again, I wouldn't remotely disregard the threat that they potentially pose. But what I would say is that the thing we do know is they've never actually fought since 1979. Okay. Sorry, Joe, I'd interrupted you earlier.
No, that's right.
Something else there.
Yeah, I think there's some like delays in communications here. So I think we should open up to Q&A. Lily, what do you think?
Can you hear me? Have we got a
yeah, all good. Yeah, we have some technical errors. We hear you sometimes in delay, but the main message was clear enough. So thank you so much, Gavin, for giving so much insight into how the politics within China looks like, how their foreign policy is posing a threat to the global business and trade flows, and of course also by noting the military capacities in the very hot, let's say, topic of Taiwan right now. So I think we're ready for the questions. Please, everybody that wants to have microphone on, please do raise the hand. Bottom down, you have a hand there, so please push the button if you would like to get yourself backed with a microphone and video. As for the chat already, we covered some of these questions. So we talked about the prospects of the yuan replacing the dollar. We talked about the foreign, the internal politics of China and the diplomats. We talked about no, we didn't talk. We talked a bit about the semiconductors industry. There is a question here. So how might semiconductor companies, especially the Dutch, Japanese, Korean, Taiwanese companies, react to the ongoing US tech war, where US is urging these companies to reduce their sales to China on security grounds, and how likely is for China to retaliate? How do you think they will position themselves on this matter? If you can comment on this, dear Gavin.
Well, I think China will be quite reluctant to. It's already with its supply of semiconductors already constrained by the American embargo, to then add to the problems that they have, until I'm sure they're obviously working 24 hours a day to develop their own capacity. But until they do that, which could take years, if ever, they will need to source their semiconductors and so on. The real issue is what the Americans would do about it, I suspect, is that they've already they're leaning on the South Koreans not to China and or indeed to Russia or anywhere else. Again, I'm not clear what they've said to the Dutch or the Japanese, but one can imagine if they've said it to the South Koreans, strong relations, and they have a alliance with, they would be having similar conversations with the Dutch, Japanese, and indeed anyone else in a bid to maintain the validity of their embargo. It's the point about it is to change China's position and views on key issues which the Americans want a result from. So they're not going to compromise. The Americans are not going to compromise on this, certainly, and frankly, either side of the coming American election. It's cross the aisle, as they say, in the States. So this looks quite embedded. There doesn't seem to be any likely compromise from the States. Again, China will do everything in its power to get what it needs from wherever it can.
Thank you for this comment. John, you have a question for us?
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Gavin. It's a great insight that you've given us. And I was just going to comment, which might be a really obvious thing to say after what you've spoken about, particularly with regard to the general population's concern around a military combat with China. But more, I would see it more possibly being, they can create far more damage on a technological basis, with increasing cyber attacks and disruption that way, rather than going down the road of a military route. Would you agree or comment on that, Gavin?
I would agree. No, I would definitely agree. I would think that, but it's, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, in the 19th, early 20th century, mobilization of forces was the precursor to war, and it was always treated as such. You know, we go back to, I don't know, the Schlieffen Plan in 1914, which forced everybody, you know, alerted the French and the Russians and everybody to the fact that the Germans were on the move. And this had been the case really all the way back, basically since Napoleon and so forth, possibly earlier. Cyber warfare or cyber attacks are I would suggest, are the modern equivalent of mobilization. That is to say, pinprick attacks, you know, annoying attacks, things that, you know, denial of service and messing around with people's websites and all that sort of stuff, which is sort of what I would just call, you know, back bedroom stuff. But the actual serious cyber attacks, which I think you're suggesting, where you close down electricity grids and you open the you know, sort of dam you know, water catchment areas and stop railways in their tracks and all this sort of stuff, all no doubt technically possible, or certainly something that people are trying to achieve. That would be, I would suggest, would be seen as basically an act of war. So while it would not be kinetic in the formal sense of how wars begin, it would just be the modern version of an opening shot, because whoever is on the receiving end of it is going to have to respond some way, or their allies will, or it will be perceived as the as I say, the beginning of something else. And where is it going to stop? So, as in any confrontation, once you feel you're under threat, you obviously feel you then feel you have to respond in some form or another, which it may be cyber going back the other way, but then the whole thing gets, you know, obviously escalated and it ends up usually shots fired. I hope that helps.
Yes, thank you so much for the answers and for the ideas shared, Gavin. If there are no other questions, since as what I see, so please, both of you, if you can have just a final remark. So if we have to look at this moment in time, yeah, China in the world, what would be the main idea that a business person, a business strategist should take from this context, and what they should look at when dealing with China in general?
Well, I mean, what we would advise, and we would advise this, you know, not just in any situation where uncertainty is increasing rather than decreasing, and I would say that is very much the case here, is contingency. That is to say, within the organization, there should be a sort of discussion across all the players and all the as to what should be done, I think, and what should be done under certain scenarios and conditions. Resilience, what would happen if it did happen, and again, different companies have different tolerances to business interruption and so forth. My analogy has always been when I was working in Indonesia during a time of great chaos. There was the difference between an oil company and a biscuit manufacturer. They're both right in the midst of chaos, but they both have different tolerances. And I would say that I would repeat that here in this context. There would be other human resources things, duty of care. There are ways of how you think about your people and your staff, which you need to do, and you obviously should do it anyway. But to contextualize it in terms of something which is, for example, very current at the moment, like Sudan. People clearly didn't think through what on earth would happen to their staff in Khartoum or elsewhere. Shamefully in the form of governments, which seem to be quite slow, or some were quick. But companies need to think in the same way, and they need to war game these, as the expression is. It's just to sit there, have an away day with the main players, and say, well, what would happen in Taiwan if this thing started to, or indeed in China, if this thing started to go, if relations between the US or China or started to become toxic to the point where people were uneasy, and clearly something unknown but very unpleasant was likely to happen. So that's those would be my operational takeaways for companies, to things they can actually do, and I think should do. As a matter of course, and I'm sure a great many do, as I'm sure I'm telling people, just what they know perfectly well. But this, and it should be routine. It should be readdressed on a, shall we say, certainly an annual basis, but then also on the basis as events unfold. If something happens, I mean, if there is, for example, a sort of what appears to be a minor clash in the South China Sea between a Chinese and shall we say, an American warship. It doesn't quite go to conflict, but it gets very close to it. And things like that should be fed into corporate sort of contingency planning and tested, and your people tested, your own staff tested as to how to respond.
Thank you so much for these comments. I mean, the recommendations are more than useful for any business person, of course, whether you're an entrepreneur, so in charge of the decision, or you're an insider influencer, you're an employee and you do want to raise the attention about these topics. Thank you, Gavin, for all the insights that you have provided. It's absolutely clear that we're living in interesting times, as a Chinese saying tells us, and that's keeping us busy 24/7. Joe, if you would like to have a final comment and on this.
No, I think Gavin's pretty much covered all the bases, and I think without kind of explicitly saying it, he's identified a lot of good examples and how they can kind of impact businesses. But I think for businesses that operate, even if they don't operate kind of on a global level, they should still have a kind of global outlook, right? Because I think if anything, COVID, the Ukraine conflict, even the US-China trade war, and now the events happening with respect to China in different theaters, do have a kind of ripple effect, and they do kind of impact businesses on some level or another. So that would be my final kind of comments on that. And Gavin, again, it's always a pleasure, having these types of discussions with you. And I know a lot of viewers have gotten a lot of insight from this. We'll be kind of wrapping this up as a recording, and we're going to be sending that to our clients that we have, and I'm sure they'll gain a lot of value out of it as well. So thank you very much.
Well, thanks, Joe, and thank you very much indeed. And thank everybody for putting up with me and my croaky voice.
That wasn't an issue because your ideas were more valuable than any internet disruption and any virus that will impact your courts. Thank you everybody for attending. Thank you for the questions. Thank you for the wonderful insight, Gavin. It was fantastic. As Joe already mentioned, this will be wrapped up in a recording that will be shared with those that subscribe to our NSSG Talks series. And yeah, looking forward to further make accessible the knowledge and the lessons of real valuable experts such as Gavin Greenwood. Thank you so much for joining us today, and have a wonderful rest of the day.